In this lecture video, we're going to be looking at Karl Marx's political theory, focusing mainly on the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And I actually want to begin with the opening lines of the manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. I want to begin with this famous line because why Marx says this is that he's not saying, look, I'm going to make a moral critique of capitalism. I'm going to give a moral reason why, communism is more ideal. He is saying it is due to the internal contradictions of capitalism itself that makes communism inevitable. And this is due to his methodology of historical and dialectical materialism, where, in the German ideology, he outlines his methodology of historical materialism, this idea of beginning our investigation into all the concepts that philosophers are interested in, beginning our investigations with sensuous, material human life. And from there, Marx tries to argue, as we'll see in a moment, a whole kind of history of epics, a series of successions of epics that really ground how human social reproduction occurs. And in Marx's argument for communism, he is trying to show, look, I'm not arguing I've thought of this better system called communism. He's trying to say, I want to show you that the internal contradictions of capitalism make it such that communism will always be there as long as capitalism exists. Because communism comes from those contradictions of capitalism. And we'll see exactly what those are. So Marx argues that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. And he gives us a brief account in the manifesto, which we should really understand that the manifesto is like a political pamphlet, kind of for public readership. It's not really an academic work. It's not even like the German ideology, for example, which was a philosophical work criticizing German philosophers, mainly left Hegelians or the young Hegelians. And it's, of course, much less a kind of economic, political, piece of work like Capital, the first 4 volumes. The point of the manifesto is just to say, look, there's a certain kind of intuition that you as the worker have about your precarious situation, and I'm trying to show you there's a political movement that is based on that intuition you have. And what Marx tries to briefly show in the manifesto is that the struggle of class and capitalism is not necessarily unique. Now, what we find in human history is a development of human existence and the means of social reproduction through class antagonism. Now, we have the first epic he calls the Asiatic, which is basically the patriarchal family dichotomy, where you basically have chieftains and then family units and then slaves. So it's very much kind of a local a local relationship of how society is based. Now, once we really kind of get human progress going in the ancient epic, this is characterized by the master-slave antagonism. And this is not saying, look, ancient, Greek and Roman society, there were, everybody was either a master or a slave. He's trying to say that the basis of society was this master-slave class antagonism. And that's not to say there weren't free laborers. There were free laborers. But this is where you have the complete development of the class relation between citizens and slaves. And this is where the political society then revolves around that distinction, where the masters are also political leaders. The feudal epic comes from the internal contradictions of the master-slave class kind of dialectic. The feudal epic is based on the lord-serf dialectic, the antagonism between lord and serf, which is a hierarchical structure of land ownership via an association of a ruling class that ties the serf to the land. Now notice then, right? In the ancient epic, the slave was tied to an individual. But in feudalism, the serf is not, owned by an individual. They're not owned by the lord. They're owned by the land. Then you also, of course, have free laborers. But these exist, as Marx says, under the command of smaller conglomerates of capital. Society, the social fabric of society, much less the political fabric, and the basis of society, is not based around these small conglomerates of capital and free labor. It's based around the feudal structure of the lord and the serf. Now, what we see from the ancient epic to the feudal epic is actually slight freedom for the serf. Because the serf is no longer tied to, an individual owner, they are more free than the slave. Of course, they're not politically free, right? The lord is, the ultimate authority over the serf. But the serf still owns some of the land of which they are tied to. They work it. And they own, then, in that sense, their own means of subsistence. So what we can already begin to see is throughout human history, when we look at the class basis of society, some people have greater political and economic freedom, like the master and the lord, where in both cases, right, their economic ability for subsistence is guaranteed by the slave, and then is guaranteed in feudalism by the serf. And of course, they're completely politically free as they determine the political conditions for their society. But you have then a progression of the slave to the serf, of greater economic freedom, though not political freedom. Now, of course, the serf is still not completely economically free because, economic and political freedom are related, as Marx tries to argue. But what we find through the internal contradictions of feudalism, as it breaks down and leads to the rise of capitalism and these smaller conglomerates of capital growing, we find the emergence of a new class-based society, of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And these are French terms. The bourgeoisie just means those who own the means of production, and the proletariat, those who don't, those who have to work for the owner of the means of production. So this class-based distinction is a hierarchical maximization of the division of labor that are centered around industrial production with armies of free labor employed by owners of the means of production. As we saw from the slave to the serf, where the serf is a little more free than the slave, the proletariat is, of course, more free than the serf, because the proletariat is free to work for any capitalist or member of the bourgeoisie that they want. The proletariat also has a certain political freedom, right, that the serf obviously doesn't have. Because in at least a liberal democratic society, the proletariat can vote. They have a say in elections of who is going to determine the laws. But what Marx wants to show is that even in capitalism, there is still social coercion. Political coercion may almost entirely be gone, but economically, the proletariat is still connected to a class. Now, in the slave, they're connected to the individual, the master. The serf is connected to the land. The proletariat is not connected to any capitalist. They're connected to the capitalist class. And why? Because the proletariat cannot subsist without being employed by the capitalist class. So what Marx tries to show is what you have is basically the distinction between master and slave is the most stark. The lord and serf come closer together, and then the bourgeoisie and proletariat come even closer. What does that mean? That as production increases, as technological advancements, as advancements in politics and the idea of freedom and justice and equality, as these continue, society, and they are continuing actually Marx is trying to argue on a material basis of social reproduction, that society is moving towards a classless society, where eventually there will no longer be a need for class distinctions. And that means, for Marx, the movement of history, why human existence is a history of class struggles, is that it is tending towards a classless society where there is universal emancipation from all forms of coercion. So we need to be clear about some terms. Capitalism is not the free market, and it is not free enterprise, right? People often talk about capitalism as being this kind of like competition where you can invest and commit yourself, and if you work hard, you might be able to make it, or that capitalism is just the state not being involved. The French term laissez-faire, let it be. This is not capitalism at all. Capitalism is the economic system of social reproduction that is characterized by two necessary features: class-based means of production, and the endless pursuit of the valorization of capital or profit. That's Marxian terminology, the valorization of capital. Now, you don't have capitalism if you don't have both of these, which is why we can say that, well, financial capitalism, when we look at the banks, this doesn't exactly show the kind of class-based means of production in terms of the proletariat. You have the maximization of profit through financial capital, but they are still loosely tied together to the material ground of society, which is the class-based reproduction of the dependence of a working class, of which then the banks, are related to the capitalist class. And then we should also understand the term means of production, which is just private property that requires labor to increase its value. And this is different, from mere property or personal property. We could say private property is really understood in capitalism as that which increases its value. So you could say, like, I don't know, I have a soda water here, right? And I could say, well, this soda water is my property, but it's not capital. Capital is that which increases its value through labor. So these terms Marx wants to show us is that they are social, right? We can't think of these things as isolated, natural things. They're related to a social system of reproduction. And that's what we're talking about when we're criticizing the extent to which there's coercion and domination in capitalism. It's that it is social. They're socially produced, socially situated. So what we're looking at here, Marx is trying to say, is you, the worker, you are not entirely free. You require material preconditions. And in capitalism, the means now, the technology exists to meet those preconditions, to realize universal emancipation. But this requires transcending capitalism. Part of this is because you can't just rely on the state. The state in capitalism, in many ways, is an extension of the capitalist class. Now, Marx doesn't really give us a theory of the state. He wanted to write a book on the state, although he never was able to do it before he died. But one of the traditional interpretations of Marxism, of Marx's theory of the state, is this notion of economism, that the state is simply an extension of, capital, that really the state just does whatever is in the best interest of capital. To some extent, this is definitely true. I mean, there was a study that came out some years ago that tried to show, in the United States, for example, 90% of all legislation passed is not responsive to public opinion at all. That at best, public opinion has a 10% influence on legislation. The 90% actually comes from, special interests, capital, lobbying, things like that. So to some extent, it's just true that capital has this influence on the state that is, undemocratic. But that's not really what Marx is trying to say. He's not just trying to say, look, the state is irrelevant because what really matters is the material base of society. What Marx is trying to argue is that in capitalism, there is a bifurcation of the political, which is why it has required union and labor struggles to achieve, for example, the 40-hour work week. So the bifurcation of the political means that the structures and practices of capitalist market societies systematically generate an impoverished form of the political. And it does so in two ways. Okay? Capitalism obfuscates the extent to which the dimensions of social and economic life are political. Now, it does this to the extent in which we don't see the fact that workers are alienated or exploited or dominated by a class. We don't see that as political, right? That is just voluntary free choice, and that's out of the hands of the state. The state should have no say in that because, it's seen as non-political affairs, right? Economic affairs, affairs of individuals coming together. On the other hand, the political realm then of life is actually impoverished. So you have an obfuscation of the political dimensions of the social and economic life, and then you have political life being impoverished by the exclusion of inherently political matters, since the capitalist state cannot introduce reforms that overcome the bifurcation of the political without dismantling itself, because the capitalist state doesn't recognize the economic and social spheres of life as being political. We can also add to this the problem that if communism then is a transcendence of class-based society, the final transcendence to a classless society, the idea has typically been understood that the state dissolves. Now, certainly it would be true that the capitalist state is meant to dissolve. There's no longer a need for it. But would that necessarily be the case if the problem of capitalism is that there's this bifurcation of the political? Because it seems like Marx wants to say, no, there actually is like a political realm of existence. There's a political sphere of life. The goal then is to actually make it more autonomous or to show it, to give it more power. So these are some of the questions that are just left with us with the fact that Marx didn't really write a theory of the state. And the fact that sometimes when he does mention the state, he'll say the state is just an entity for the ends of the capitalist class. But then again, is he meaning the capitalist state, which is different from the idea of government in general? So these are kind of open-ended questions and ideas that are debated in Marxian scholarship. Now, that the political is bifurcated in capitalism really demonstrates the extent to which the worker will be unable to be truly free until a class-based society is overcome. And I want to read this quote from Volume 3 of Capital. Marx says, "The realm of freedom really begins only where the labor determined by necessity and external expediency end. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production proper. That real freedom cannot exist where we are bound and constantly confronted by necessity, our needs. If you have to work to make ends meet, and that's the best you can do, and you struggle, you cannot be truly free. As we'll see, freedom requires free time, and that is not available to you if you can only work to make ends meet." So he says, just as the savage must wrestle with nature to satisfy his needs, to maintain and reproduce his life, so must civilized man. And he must do so in all forms of society and under all possible means of production. This realm of natural necessity expands with his development, because his needs do too. So, as he talks about in the German ideology, for example, as we are able to reproduce ourselves, we start to create new wants and new needs and desires. So then we create new things to satisfy these desires, which enables more desires to be created. So there's this kind of feedback loop that occurs as we enhance our ability for social reproduction. Freedom, then, he says, in this sphere can consist only in this: that socialized man, the associated producers, govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under their collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power. So bringing under control the capacity for social reproduction, democratizing then, bringing it under control by human beings themselves and not letting it be controlled by a handful of individuals. Accomplishing it with the least expenditure of energy and conditions most worthy and appropriate for their human nature. But this always remains a realm of necessity. The true realm of freedom, then, the development of human powers as an end in itself, right? This idea that true freedom is when you can use your human capabilities as an end in themselves, rather than just as a means to an end, which in capitalism, that end is ultimately the maximization of profit, as if we look at it as a whole. Now, as an individual, of course, it can be different things. Like as a worker, ultimately in capitalism, the first and ultimate end you have to meet is to ensure that you survive, that you have a roof over your head, pay your bills. If you're the capitalist, it's profit. Without profit, you can't survive because you're necessarily in competition with other capitalists. As a whole, for society, though, in capitalism, it is profit that is the end. All of our desires are ultimately subsumed by the need to maximize profit. So, the true realm of freedom, Marx says, the development of human powers as an end in itself, begins beyond it, beyond the realm of necessity, though it can only flourish with this realm of necessity as its basis. The reduction of the working day, then, is the basic prerequisite. So we cannot simply achieve freedom in any society. And this is why Marx is trying to argue he's not just pulling this idea of freedom, out of his head. He's not just sitting in his armchair. He's looking at the history of human social reproduction. And he's seeing what is required to realize freedom are preconditions. And those preconditions are a certain level of production. And capitalism, with the rise of industry, has enabled those preconditions to be met. But the only way they will serve the ends of human freedom is if those means of production are in the hands of society itself and not a handful of individuals. So freedom is incomplete if it only exists in abstract form, as he thinks. In the case of liberalism and liberal democracy, freedom only exists abstractly or formally. It must be realized concretely. And that means preconditions must be met in three ways. So certain technological advancements rendering material abundancy need to be met so that people can be, 1, free from material want, 2, free from toil, and 3, free from the burden of devoting the greater part of their time to the struggle with necessity. Marx argues that you cannot really be free if you're not free from material want. Because as long as you are in the back of your head needing to think about, okay, I need to survive, I need to make sure I have enough food and my shelter, you can't pursue the ends of the rational ends of humanity itself. You can't be free to pursue your own ultimate desires of, philosophy or being good at sports or painting or, architecture, any discipline, any profession. I mean, think about this is why many people try to argue that healthcare should be a right. Because, for example, if healthcare is tied to your employer, well, how can you really pursue the best job for you? How can you really pursue what you want to do in life if you have to risk giving up healthcare? Because when you give up that job to maybe pursue another job, you might be giving up the fact that maybe I won't have health insurance for a little while. And do I want to take that risk? If health insurance were guaranteed, then nobody would ever have to think twice about whether they want to give up a job in pursuit of a better job, something more fulfilling. 2, free from toil. We need to understand that being free from toil is not the same as being free from labor. Marx thinks that labor is human. It is part of our nature to labor, because laboring is an extension of ourselves. But toiling is not. Doing remedial, hard labor, that is not enjoyable. And it's not something that allows us to pursue what we might ultimately desire, whatever that may be. So there's a distinction then between toil and labor. And the preconditions of freedom free us from toil, but they allow us then to labor freely in ways that we want. And finally, being free from the burden of devoting the greater part of their time to the struggle with necessity. That once the struggle of necessity is overcome, once, for example, you don't have a risk of not being able to produce enough food, of scarcity, which capitalism has achieved. Anytime there is scarcity, it's not actually a problem anymore. In fact, capitalism has to manufacture scarcity and able to maintain profit in many different industries. It has realized the ability to produce all of our basic needs. And I want to give one example then of where these preconditions are so important. I mentioned time earlier. Freedom presupposes free time, because only when we have free time can we pursue the rational ends of humanity itself. Only then, when we have an abundance of resources, are we free from the struggle with necessity. Are we guaranteed free time then to pursue what we want for the sake of what we want? Think about the fact that if you have more wealth, now you may be under certain kinds of pressures, but you have the freedom to choose to be under those pressures. When you have more wealth, you have more free time. But if you are of the working class, and especially if you are poor, you do not. Time then is a social privilege. A society cannot be free, Marx thinks, if time is a social privilege. So if those are the preconditions, what are the conditions of freedom? Well, to understand the conditions of freedom, we would need to know what are the conditions that characterize communism. What would communist society consist in? The problem is that Marx spent most of his life analyzing capitalism, studying capitalism. He didn't really theorize too much about the future. There are some areas in which he does try to give an account, I guess you could say, of what communism consists in. One of the most famous ones is actually in the German ideology, where he says, in communism, one basically wouldn't be, a painter or a carpenter or a farmer. Instead, they would be free to fish in the morning, farm during the day, paint at night, things like that. But we also get in the manifesto this line where he says that communism is an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And what we get then is this reciprocity, wherein you have society being related to the individual, that it is understood how they're related, where they co-determine one another, and they do so in a reciprocal way, where as I work, my freedom to work enables the freedom of everyone else to work. And the fact that everyone else is able to work freely, I am able to work freely. So there is no longer this distinction, this notion that we are just atomistic individuals, but the way in which we were able to go about our lives, there's a kind of reciprocity between each other. Wherein, and this might almost be kind of Kantian, there's a kind of kingdom of ends, wherein all of our ends are the condition for the ability for all of us to pursue our own ends. Now, of course, the difference with Marx here is in the Kantian case, it's kind of, Marx would say, idealistic, and Marx is trying to give a material account for what this would consist in. There's also a line I wanted to mention from his essay, The Critique of the Gotha Program, where he says, perhaps is a bit more famous, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And we can really, I think, understand this one as to say, well, the way in which things would be distributed is not simply that everybody gets an equal amount of everything, but that there's a kind of equity involved in distribution, such that some people, if you have a larger family, might need resources. If you have a smaller family, you might need less resources. If you have a child with a disability, you might need more resources than a family with another, single child as well. So there's a way in which then Marx isn't trying to say communism is kind of like a blanket equality or an equality of outcomes, but that the way in which resources are distributed is equitable and such that then all members of society contribute in ways that best suit them. So there's a way in which then, in communism, nobody could just leech off of society, Now, you wouldn't have the kind of burdensome, remedial, boring work that people hate. You could have machines do those things, right? In communism, the means of production would be owned by all, such that then when you have new technological innovation, like in the case of AI would be used to free people from boring work that we hate. But that would mean then people would be free to help others in more meaningful ways, in ways that they would ideally enjoy. So I think if we wanted to kind of translate these two, I'll call them precepts, if we wanted to translate these two precepts into kind of more like analytic, egalitarian language, as is used by egalitarian philosophers, more contemporary philosophers, I think we could say that what Marx is really trying to describe the conditions of freedom to be is a kind of community or a reciprocal equality of opportunity, kind of community-related equality of opportunity, such that no one is to be disadvantaged by material luck, and material luck meaning a kind of like misfortune, so it wasn't due to your own choice, right? Like, let's say you were just born into a poor family. Well, that's just like material luck. So just because you were born into a poor family doesn't mean then you should have, worse access to education, for example. That's through no fault of your own. So no one should be disadvantaged by material luck. And two, that all unchosen disadvantages, such that differences of outcome reflect nothing but differences of taste and choice, not differences in natural and social capacities and powers. So all unchosen disadvantages then are the result of our own choice, such that then they don't affect, our ability to still pursue our own rational ends. So any resulting differences then in benefits and burdens wouldn't constitute inequalities of benefits and burdens. So like, for example, I bet on like a sports team and I lose my bet. It doesn't mean then I lose my house because I'm bankrupt, right? So there would kind of be limits such that society wouldn't allow these kinds of things because, of course, you wouldn't be in a position to be homeless, for example, because housing is required in order to be free to pursue your own rational ends, and an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all would not enable the possibility of being homeless. So this is kind of just to paint a little picture of what Marx argues the conditions of freedom would be in communism. So how do we actually achieve communism? So we've seen this kind of historical account, this historical materialist account of the progression towards greater freedom, moving from the ancient epic of the dialectic of the master and slave to feudalism with the lord and serf, and now we live in capitalism, the dialectic of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. How do we then achieve communism? And in the second section, Marx tries to argue this, and we can really break this down into 3 points. First, the proletariat must become the ruling class in order to win the battle of necessity and freedom. In other words, then, the government must be a government for the people and by the people. It must be a truly democratic government where you can't have capital influencing the policy of government. Now, that would mean then that the proletariat would use the power of the state once the state was seized and no longer used by capitalists, or the capitalist class, all capital then would be taken from the bourgeoisie, and it would be used to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, which again is controlled by the working class, which is, the majority, the masses, the people. So this would mean that the total productive forces of society would need to be increased as rapidly as possible to fully achieve the preconditions of freedom. Now, you have to remember this was written in the industrial era of the 19th century. I think very much now we would say the preconditions of freedom in industrialized societies has been realized. So whether we would need to then increase the productive forces of society as rapidly as possible, potentially not. But Marx does admit that this will mean that in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and the conditions of bourgeois production. And I want to highlight this because he's saying, yes, that means, we are going to violate the right to private property for capitalists, because we're going to say, no, the means of production can't be privately owned. They must be communally owned. They must be owned by the workers themselves. But that doesn't mean then the rights of individuals, right, are to be violated. And I think that's a distinction to keep in mind here, that Marx is not arguing then a kind of violent coup, violent in terms of, towards other human beings. Although it is a revolution, right? There's probably going to be fighting against the capitalist class. But what he's trying to say is there will be violence against private property, because we will seize private property as the working class. And I just want to highlight that difference. We could also debate about that difference as well, and whether that's required. But the third point is that he says the communists then must be the vanguard, because only they can see the international line of march throughout all the differing national struggles. And this is really important, because Marx is trying to say, look, the role of the Communist Party is to try and, first he thinks communism has to be revolutionary, because if you just have a revolution in one place, well, then the capitalist forces are going to overthrow it. And historically, we know that to be the case. Anytime there was a communist revolution, even a peaceful one. Look at, in Chile, when Salvador Allende was democratically elected, he was overthrown in a coup. Anytime that happens, right, capital moves to prevent communism from being tried peacefully and democratically. But the idea is also, you're going to have different workers that are from different national backgrounds, or they're going to have interests that might differ in different, ways culturally from other workers. And so to kind of keep those, as he calls them, the national conflicts from getting in the way of the revolution, you need a political party that's able to see, okay, we need to see over the trees for the forest. We need to see the forest itself, the bigger picture, and not get trapped in the individual trees. And that's why then you need a communist party who is going to kind of help guide workers to realize the preconditions of freedom. So again, the revolutionary strategy is basically the working class needs to become the ruling class, such that then you can abolish class distinction, but you can't abolish class distinction until you have seized the means of production and then democratized the means of production. Now, at the end of the second section, again, he also gives a kind of general political strategy. Now, this has oftentimes been thought to be like, this is what communism is, but this list is not communism. It's meant to be just like a temporary, these are kind of the policies that would be passed by the revolutionary government in order to move towards communism. This would consist in the abolition of private property. So again, not personal property as in like your house, but the means of production. So, like industry. A progressive income tax. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. So these would be like when the wealthy try to flee with their capital, you would stop them from doing so. Centralization of all the credit in the hands of the state, which would become the national bank. Centralization of the means of transportation and communication. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. equal liability of all to labor, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries by a gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country, and free education for all children in public schools and abolition of all child labor. So these are the things that then are required, Marx argues, in order to try and realize the preconditions of freedom. So now that we've briefly seen the revolutionary strategy, I want to consider this in light of, of course, the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the, all the things that we learn about, especially in the United States. And I want to ask, how should we think about the way in which the Soviet Union attempted to realize this revolutionary strategy? And we should, of course, keep in mind there were later developments of how this strategy should be pursued, because the Russian Revolution, happened decades after Marx had died. And I think we should see in the case of the Soviet Union, it's pretty clear that in communism, the distinction between, owner and worker is meant to dissolve. And in the Soviet Union, there clearly was not the abolition of this dialectic or the antagonism in class, because if you just say, okay, there's no longer going to be a private owner of capital who's going to tell the worker what to do, but instead there's going to be a state bureaucrat who's going to tell the worker what to do, that's clearly not freeing the worker from alienation or exploitation. So I think there's an easy way in which one can criticize the Soviet Union and their failure to clearly free the worker, I guess, in the working class, we could say. But in terms of the violence in the Soviet Union as well, not the Russian Revolution, but the kind of state repression that we saw in the Soviet Union, I think that would clearly be criticized by Marx. Marx never advocated kind of repression of civil liberties. Now, he did argue repression of the economic liberties of the capitalists insofar as, right, seizing the right to, abolishing the right to private property. But Marx would say that that's not a violation of civil liberties, since private property prevents everyone from being free, right? It prevents universal emancipation, he would say. But I think there's also another reason we could see Marx would clearly be opposed to the repression and totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, and that is just to look at the Paris Commune, which Marx lived through and wrote about. When he would write his piece, The Civil War in France, Marx would actually later say that no special stress is laid on the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2. That no special stress, then, should be laid on all those measures we just looked at. He said that passage would, in many respects, be differently worded today. And he also said that the working class cannot then simply lay hold of ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, right? Because he saw the way in which, basically you had this seizure of Paris by a communistic party, and they attempted to pass all kinds of reforms, like, free education and things like that. And it basically failed. The state wasn't really able to be used in a way that could achieve the preconditions of freedom as Marx had argued. And then you had the state, in the revolution basically just overthrown once again by capital forces, as happens time and time again. And so Marx is then saying the measures he proposed at the end of Section 2, that kind of political program, would be very differently worded, today, he said. And this has actually led many people to try and debate, what does that mean? How should the revolution occur? How can you achieve the preconditions of freedom? And what role should the state play? You had someone like, Lenin, who argued that, well, actually the state, the capitalist state needs to be smashed. It can't be used. You just have to destroy the state and form a revolutionary government. He had this whole idea about what that consists in his book, State and Revolution. You then had libertarian Marxists who would say, look, Marx is admitting we can't rely on the state to achieve freedom. So that's why we had to abolish the state from the beginning. And then you have kind of the social Democrats who would say, no, see, that's why you can't just seize the state. You have to work democratically from within the state to try and pass these reforms over time, and it can't just happen immediately. So there are many different interpretations that would later happen in light of the failure of the Paris Commune, something that is still obviously debated today. One thing that is certain is that any advances that have been made towards realizing the preconditions of freedom, they came through union struggles, through labor struggles, right? I already mentioned the 40-hour work week, but, the right to worker safety, the right to certain kind of pay, retirement, sick leave, all those kinds of things, those happen because workers fought for them. Sometimes literally, in West Virginia, for example, the term redneck came from workers who would put red bandanas on their necks to identify themselves in battle. They literally went to battle against the capitalist class in West Virginia. I want to say the early 20th century, because they were fighting for better worker safety and better pay, better conditions. So sometimes they literally went to battle and not just figuratively in terms of a strike. So with all that said, I'll just end on this, I think, good discussion question. So Marx argues a class-based society cannot be a free society. So do you agree that a class-based society cannot be free? Is it feasible to have a classless society? So one question is really just asking about the idea. Do you agree that freedom requires a classless society? The second question is asking, though, about feasibility. Because one might say, yes, ideally there would be a classless society, but it's not feasible, right? That's the kind of the realistic response. So two different ways to think about this idea of freedom that Marx argues for.